Jennifer. Hello? Okay. Jennifer Mendelson. Go back where? I'm at it now. I'm standing. Okay. Okay, so you see me and everything.
Let me speak to her.
Hold on.
Hey, Jen. Jen?
I'm good.
Bye. Here's a...
Hello? We're good, Jen. Thank you. Bye. All right, we're good to go. Rabbi should be here soon. How you guys feel? Happy New Year. Everybody good?
Holidays are over, but it's dismal for you to change your dark and cold, right?
Scrappy vitamin D.
Really?
He said your vitamin D is. I said, why? He was like, don't worry, all the North States so high, you need vitamin D. If you don't get enough sunlight during this time of year, it's like it helps. So I take one a week. He told me to take one a week. He's like, take one a week for the next 6 months, and then come back to the office and we'll reevaluate your blood work again and everything. Okay.
I take 2 a day.
It's depressing. Just look outside.
But you know, no matter how bad law is better than
Nah.
anytime.
High school.
There was a horrible snowstorm. 1954. It was 54 or 50. It wasn't old enough to remember. Well, rub it in, but. No, it was. I remember walking to school once. But you couldn't get 50. The city was paralyzed. Now, I was listening to the radio. I couldn't. Which was something I only did for Mrs. So-and-so, she'd get her location. So-and-so is in labor. They couldn't reach her.
Oh, wow. The city was like completely shut down.
Yeah, because now the streets are the lines are come down. Yeah. Now it was clear. Yeah. I know. It was no just to wake up in the morning.
Can't go to school, but I go outside and play in the snow.
Yeah, you bet.
Now we've got things going
Yeah.
I had
It's beautiful. I'll say that. It's just cold. Today is real cold. It seems like the moon's just extra.
It's not. What is it? 32.
full jacket, like a coat. I can't. It's hard for me to drive when it's anything, so I wear stuff like this. I'm good. Yeah. I feel like Martin cold in the car, so when I got a big puffy jacket.
Hello. Good morning.
Just wanted to let you know it's this week and the week, 2 weeks, and then I'm having, in the midst of cancer stuff, and I'm having a second surgery.
Okay.
So
When?
The 22nd of January. So it's nothing you said. I'm going to try to come as soon as I can.
I hope you will, and let me know if I can do anything for you.
Appreciate it.
If you want some conversation, a cup of coffee,
I appreciate
anytime.
it. I appreciate it, but I want you to know I very much enjoy this, and I'm not missing it on purpose.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'll bring a note from my mom.
There you go, I was going to ask for that.
Good morning. You are an Emily Dickinson fan, aren't you?
Am I ever?
Oh, God, you can have this.
Seriously?
I can't make sense out of her. I've had that book for 20 years, and I keep going back to it. Nothing.
Is
You
it-
may have it.
There's a poem with the first line, there's a certain slant of light. Take a look at it. If you think about it a little bit, you'll see there's something very powerful there. It's a
Okay.
powerful poem with access. If you forget it, if the title,
Put it on poetry next week. You're not here next week.
maybe not. Good morning, good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Good to see everybody. Happy New Year. Hope everybody has a wonderful, healthy, productive, flourishing year. 2024, hard to believe, isn't it? Today is January 6th, of course, and that's the third anniversary of the insurrection. Maybe we should pause just for a second and just think about the awfulness of that event and its danger to our democracy and to our commonwealth, and we need to not allow democracy to dissipate. So why don't we just pause and ponder for a second that awful day. Okay. Let me first thank those who have participated in our, let's call it, bagel enterprise. First of all, thanks to Sandy Zeev for sponsoring the bagels in memory of Sam Zeev and May Roby. Thank you so much, Sandy. Thanks to Nancy and Russell Ben-Giat for sponsoring streaming. And the note that I got about that included the following. Thank you from Florida. So thanks, Russell and Nancy, if you guys are watching in. Really wonderful to have you and to continue to have you participate in this enterprise. And to Carol Marshall for picking up the bagels. Thank you so very much. There is a list, a sheet going around. We still need some more people signing up for bagel pickup. I know this is an endeavor, and it means getting up a little bit earlier and getting underway. But it's important that we do it, and as always, I appreciate your participation. So if you see an empty date on the sheet as it comes around and you feel you can do it, please do. Okay. I have to confess to you that I'm struggling with hearing aids. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. It's been clear to me for a lot longer than I'd like to admit that I need them. My brother, with whom I do a lot of traveling, as you may know, thinks of me as one of my chief attributes is denial. And I specialize in it, but I know I need them. So I'm saying it because I have them in this morning, and my voice sounds very strange to me. You do, I guess you do. And the only way to get used to it, really, is to wear them. If I get up in the morning, I'm sorry?
The dresser is never going to get used to.
Yeah, this is true, but they're safe. I don't know if I sound strange to you. I certainly do sound strange to me. I am going to be out of town next Saturday, but fortunately, Ron Rosenfield has agreed to lead the discussion next week. It's always wonderful for me, and I know for you, that we don't have to miss a session, and that members of our group are willing to lead discussions. And we've done this over the years, and I've always heard raves about it. And one of the wonderful things about our Torah study group over the years is that when I'm not able to be here or I'm on vacation, that I can call on people to come in and lead a discussion. And people are always telling me how wonderful it has been. So please come next week. Ron is, I think, going to think about the Torah portion of the week, which is the second portion in the book of Exodus. And I'm sure you'll have a wonderful discussion, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. Okay, so blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord, our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. I forgot to welcome those who are live streaming. Always great to know that you are there. So we have been working on the idea in the Torah of friendship. We looked at the David and Jonathan friendship, and if I'm not mistaken, we came to the conclusion, however provisional, that Jonathan cares much more about David than David does about Jonathan. And Jonathan is going out of his way to help David, even at peril to himself. It always says that Jonathan loved David, but it doesn't ever say, I don't believe, that David loved Jonathan. We do have a couple of passages that do give some intimation of reciprocity, that David has strong feelings for Jonathan. I just want to review them quickly before we go on to Ruth and Naomi. So the first is in 1 Samuel chapter 20. You can go there. I'm just going to read a little bit. 1 Samuel chapter 20. Maybe we'll think about beginning at verse 35. So this is where Jonathan recognizes that his father Saul is enraged with David, who is on the way to supplanting him, and also at his son, who he knows favors David over himself, over his father. Page 450. So Jonathan sets up a signal for David to let David know indirectly whether or not it's dangerous for him. And if the answer is yes, then David will be able to escape. So chapter 20, verse 35, in the morning Jonathan went out into the open for the meeting with David, accompanied by a young boy. He said to the boy, "Run ahead and find the arrows that I shoot." And you remember that he had agreed with David that if the arrows go beyond David, it's dangerous, and if they fall short of David, it's safe. And he said to the boy, verse 36, "Run ahead and find the arrows that I shoot." And as the boy ran, he shot the arrows past him. When the boy came to the place where the arrow shot by Jonathan had fallen, Jonathan called out to the boy, "Hey, the arrows are beyond you," which is quite clearly an assertion to David. And Jonathan called after the boy, "Quick, hurry up, don't stop." So Jonathan's boy gathered the arrows and came back to his master. The boy suspected nothing. Only Jonathan and David knew the arrangement. Jonathan handed the gear to his boy and told him, "Take these back to the town." When the boy got there, David emerged from his concealment at the Negev. He flung himself face down on the ground and bowed low 3 times. They kissed each other and they wept together. David wept the longer. The Hebrew is higdil, the more. So this strikes me, if we were to not bring all else that we know about this relationship, if we just look at this passage, this seems to be genuine weeping on David's behalf by David. Of course, he's relieved that he's gotten the signal and knows that he needs to escape from danger, so it's not an unmixed weeping. But it does strike me as plausible that this reflects some of David's feelings for Jonathan. I don't want to push that too far, but I think we ought to look at all the evidence. If we go to, where? 2 Samuel chapter 1, where David has learned that both Saul and Jonathan have been killed, and now this is a kind of tribute to them. Chapter 1, verse 18. And David intoned this dirge. See where I am? Chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. What's that? 470. And David intoned this dirge over Saul and his son Jonathan. He ordered the Judites to be taught the song of the bow. It is recorded in the book of Yashar, itself quite interesting. As I think I said the last time, this is an indication that for the biblical author, there are extant scrolls of other books at that time that were not included in the Bible. The Bible doesn't contain the book of Yashar. He's referring to it here because evidently it exists. And that tells us that, or at least it suggests, that the process of canonization, the process by which the books available to an editor or editors were examined with scrutiny and perhaps with criteria for which ones are going to be included in the canon and which ones are not. The book of Samuel gets included. The book of Yashar doesn't. Robert Alter, actually, in his The Art of Biblical Narrative, has an interesting conjecture about criteria. He says that there are three kinds of books. This is my summary, and maybe he wouldn't agree with the way I'm putting it. There are books or scrolls, we're talking about contemporaneously, which have a great emphasis on God, the gods, God's power. The second category are books which emphasize human power. We might say that the first category features myth, the myths of the gods. The second category is much more humanistic, secular, this worldly, and features, let's call it legends. The third category, which according to Alter is the criterion for inclusion, are those scrolls that feature an interaction between God and human beings, where both have agency, both have independence of some kind or another, and that the drama of the story is the way in which there is interaction, or as we want to put it, covenant. So maybe the book of Yashar was heavily weighted toward human beings where the gods or God plays a very, very small role, or maybe it was in the first category, where the whole story is about God and human beings play a minuscule role. That's an interesting conjecture on Alter's part. Anyway, this little note here, it is recorded in the book of Yashar, has consequences. So, verse 19, your glory, O Israel, lay slain on your heights, how the mighty have fallen, and so on. Moving to verse 24, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in crimson and finery, who decked your robes with jewels of gold. How the mighty have fallen in the thick of battle, Jonathan, slain on your heights. I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You were most dear to me. Your love was wonderful to me, more than love, the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, the weapons of war perished. Okay? So that, I think, also, like 1 Samuel chapter 20, reveals David feeling deeply for Jonathan. One can overstate this. I mean, David is an extremely calculating, prudence-minded individual. And another interpretation of this poem is David is now prepared to secure his realm. He is, in the next chapters, on his way to defeating his enemies, going into Jerusalem, capturing Jerusalem, bringing the ark into Jerusalem. In other words, all the political machinations which secure power. And it just may be that this eulogy, this dirge, is another instrument in David's quest for power. It makes a lot of sense to praise those who were in power, and you are not a usurper, and you're going to praise them knowing full well that you don't need to usurp their power anymore. They're gone. And if we read, which we've done on occasion, the next chapters, 3 through 6 or 7, we see that all of David's enemies are either killed or put aside. And David seems to be exempt from the judgment of the biblical author, as if the author is trying to show us indirectly how clever, Machiavellian David is without directly blaming him. And if that's a plausible interpretation of David's now ascent to full power, then this poem is part of it. So it can either be a product of calculation or of deep feeling. And I don't know that we could wrestle it to the ground. Why not both? Jim?
Well, we've seen this in our own time, because, as I recall, when Reagan got elected and was in power, a lot of people were too thrilled, but once he was dead, it was the greatest thing since the wheel,
Yeah.
and to this day still is.
Yeah.
So,
Right. No, I think that's a good point. Right.
I think it's instructive to January 6th. I mean, it's showbiz. And even here, human nature has learned long ago how to play to
The crowd.
image.
Yeah. The importance of image. So it's a tribute in a way to the author that he is able to say some powerful things, though with a deep ambiguity. We just don't know exactly how to take this. David, the author of the biblical Psalms, may be taken to feel this deeply about Jonathan, because if David is the author of the Psalms, David is capable of deep, expansive feeling. If it's David on the political rise, chapters 3 through 6 here, then it's much more the calculating David. So, okay. So just to wrap up a little bit of our discussion of David and Jonathan's friendship. So now I want to move to the book of Ruth in the Tanakh, way at the end of the Bible, near the end. When you get the page, fourteen nineteen. So, the question about the book of Ruth, or at least an important question, is what is it about? Okay? And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about one clear theme of the book of Ruth. So, if we look at the very beginning, in the days that the judges judged, okay? In my translation, it translates judges as chieftains. Footnote in the Jewish Publication Society Bible, the leaders who arose in the period before the monarchy, others judges, okay? The problem with the word judges is we think in terms of juridical issues. There are, I don't remember how many judges in the book of Judges, all but one, let me put it differently, only one actually deals with making decisions. So the judge in the book of Judges is essentially a military leader, a person who in a moment of crisis is raised to power, defeats the enemy, and leaves the scene, leaves the stage. This is charismatic leadership. God chooses this person, and this person rises to the occasion in one way or another. But there's no dynastic implications in the notion of being a judge. One of the judges, Gideon, who does succeed in defeating the enemy and is ready to leave the stage, is asked by his supporters, stay and rule over us. In other words, let's not think of this as intermittent leadership. Let's get continuity. You've helped us. You've defeated our enemies. You're obviously competent. If you leave, we're going to be back in a situation of peril. Stay. And Gideon says in response, I will not stay, only God is your ruler. So the very notion of judgeship is what we might call a kind of pure monotheism. Of course we need human leadership, especially in times of peril. But we don't want the leader to eclipse the power, the ultimacy of God. Okay? So that the judge is precisely what a monotheistic polity would look like. Where the book of Judges, though, shows us the inadequacy, even though theologically orthodox, I might say, politically inadequate. Because the greater the enemy, the harder it is to vanquish that enemy. And if the enemy stays around, is still a threat, even having lost a few battles, you're going to need continuity of leadership. In a more primitive situation where the Ammonites attack and you defeat them and things are now peaceful again, the leader can go off the stage. But as the enemy becomes stronger and more durable, namely the Philistines, the people begin to recognize that this intermittent kind of leadership is no longer adequate, and they ask for a king. And Samuel says no. God says yes. Even though it means that they're not having full faith in me, give it to them, but warn them about how predatory the king can be. Okay? So, Ruth opens in the days that the judges judged. But let's assume that the author of the book of Ruth knows the history and that Judges is going to be seen to be inadequate. If you look at the very end of the book of Ruth, the very last word in the book of Ruth is David. So in one sense, the book of Ruth can be seen as a way of moving from one form of government to another, beginning with Judges, ending with David. It can even be seen as a kind of justification of monarchy, precisely because this story shows, in a way, how potent the arrival of David is. Okay? So one way of understanding the book of Ruth is it's offering some kind of a description, some kind of justification of the move from one form of government to another. I also want to pose another way of reading the book of Ruth and kingship. So we're gonna roam around the Bible just a little bit. First of all, let's go to Genesis chapter 19. Genesis 19, verse 30.
Page
28. Okay. So, Genesis 19 deals with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the escape of Lot and his family from Sodom and Gomorrah, and where his wife turns around and she's turned into a pillar of salt. And so now only Lot and his two daughters are left. They think that with the destruction that they see happening behind them, this is an inference, that the world has now been destroyed and only they are left. Okay? So, let's look at verse 30. Lot went up from Zoar and settled in the hill country with his two daughters, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar. And he and his two daughters lived in a cave. And the older one said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to consort with us in the way of all the world." Okay? So their view is, we're the only ones left. And unless we bear children, the history of humanity is over. So they come to the obvious inference. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father. Okay? Incest, but heroic, right? In a state of utter emergency, they do what societies from time immemorial have proscribed: incest. That night they made their father drink wine, and the older one went in and lay with her father. He didn't know when she lay down or when she rose. The next day the older one said to the younger, "See, I lay with father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go and lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father." That night they also made their father drink wine, and the younger went in and lay with him, and he didn't know when she lay down or when she rose. Thus, the two daughters of Lot came to be with child by their father. The older one bore a son and named him Moab, the etymology of which may be May-av, from father. That may be a fanciful etymology. Nevertheless, midrashically, it's potent. He's the father of the Moabites today. And the younger also bore a son and called him Ben-Ammi, and he's the father of the Ammonites today. So if we want to know the origin of these two peoples, the Moabites and the Ammonites, we have a story about it. Why is this relevant to the book of Ruth? She's a Moabite. Okay? So the ancestry of the Moabites, of Ruth, goes back to this act of incest. And here's the question. What are the chances that we get King David? The first thing that has to have happened is something like chapter 19 of Genesis, that these two girls are in a quandary, we're assuming, that they know the incest taboo, but what choice do they have? And so it requires the episode that leads to chapter 19, as well as this chance taken by the daughters. Okay? Let's turn now to Genesis 38. This is the story of Judah and Tamar. And you remember the story. Judah leaves his brothers and goes down into Canaan, and he has children. And the first child marries Tamar and dies. And the second child marries Tamar and dies. And there's a third child, and Judah feels, I'd better sequester this son because it doesn't look good for those who marry Tamar. Tamar seems to have high regard for an Israelite custom, levirate marriage. And levirate marriage. And levirate marriage is that when a man dies childless, that his wife, no, let me put it this way, his brother has an obligation, as does the wife, to have relations so that a son, I'm not sure if a daughter would do, I think only a son, but I'm not sure, would be sired to carry on the name of the deceased father, as well as, I might assume, the regularity, predictability of the inheritance of the family wealth. Okay? You need the next generations, we might say, in order that the wealth stay in the family. Okay? So Tamar, Judah, goes about his business, thinking that I'm done with her. This is my inference. but because she's dangerous to the family. But she's not done with Judah, because she recognizes the obligation to bear a son for her deceased husband. And she knows that the last son is not going to be offered to her. So she creates a ruse. She dresses as a harlot. Let's look at it here. So verse 12 of chapter 38. A long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, together with his friend Hira the Adulamite. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing. So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah, the third son, was grown up, and yet she had not been given to him as wife. Why should she care? Maybe she needs a husband, but why Shelah? An inference might be she knows something about levirate marriage, and the obligation still rests on her. So she's not been given Shelah, so she creates a ruse, okay? When Judah, verse 15, saw her, he took her for a harlot. Why? Because she's playing the harlot. Reminiscent of the daughters of Lot, who in an extreme situation do what they think is necessary to solve the problem. The daughters of Lot engage in incest. She dresses as a harlot. For she had covered her face, verse 16. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here, let me sleep with you. For he didn't know that she was his daughter-in-law. What, she asked, will you pay for sleeping with me? He replied, I will send a kid from my flock. Now, if she wants remuneration, if that's her only motivation, that kid from the flock would be sufficient. It's not sufficient because she's up to something else. But she said, you must leave a pledge until you have sent it. I need something both tangible and that uniquely identifies you. Don't give me $100 bill. I can't prove from whom it comes. But if I have your signature, then it's you. And he said, verse 18, what pledge shall I give you? And she replied, your seal and cord, right? That's your signature. And the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her. What does he care what he gives her? And he slept with her, and she conceived by him. By the way, back to verse 13. And Tamar was told, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing. I think traditionally that sheep shearing activity is accompanied by orgy, by sexual activity. And we might infer, it's an inference, that he is sexually needy. His wife has died. And therefore, what are the conditions that make the birth of Tamar's children possible? One is the whole episode of the death of the children, and only Shelah is left. And Tamar's deep understanding that she's not going to get Shelah. And Judah's sexual neediness, for which she is prepared, dressed as a harlot. These are the conditions that make the continuation of this story possible. Verse 19. Then she went her way. Well, let's go back. Verse 18. What pledge shall I give you? She replied, your seal and cord. And she replied, your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend, the Adulamite. In other words, she wants a kid, but she has some sort of security. And so now he's going to pay his debt and be done with it. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he couldn't find her. He inquired of the people of that town, "Where is the cult prostitute, the one at Enaim by the road?" But they said, "There has been no prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I could not find her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "There's been no prostitute here." Judah said, "Let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. I did send her this kid, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry." According to later biblical law, which may not apply to this pastoral situation, the harlot is executed. Okay? So she has put herself in deep peril by this ruse. "Bring her out," said Judah, "and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law. Notice, by the way, as she was being brought out, she didn't shout out in the public square, "It's Judah." She sent him a message. So she's trying to protect his dignity by just making him realize what is going on, and not everybody else. "I am with child by the man to whom these belong." She says, "Dear Judah, I have a staff and a seal here, and you know that I'm pregnant, and I've just heard you want me to be burned. I just want to let you know that maybe you happen to know the person to whom these belong. Sincerely and with deep love, your daughter-in-law, Tamar." Okay? And she added, "Examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these?" Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I am, inasmuch as I didn't give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again." Why is she more righteous? Because she accepts the obligation of levirate marriage and has put herself in danger to be sure that the family continuity continues. Okay? That's why she's more righteous. As a matter of fact, in the Hebrew, vayomer tzadka, tzedek, justice, from which we get the word tzedakah, which means, we might say, tzedakah is not just charity, it's the pursuit of justice through charity, the attempt to balance the inequities of society. Not just to give somebody something to eat, which of course is very, very important and may be sufficient, but that's how tzedakah, charity, is related to tzedek, justice. And he says she's more tzedek, she's more just than I am. So, let's continue. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread in that hand to signify this one came first. But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." So he was named Peretz. Afterward, his brother came out, on whose hand was the crimson thread. He was named Zerach. Okay? So she has two sons, Peretz and Zerach. Okay? Let's go back now to the book of Ruth and look at chapter 4. So, verse 13. So Boaz married Ruth. She became his wife. He cohabited with her. The Lord let her conceive, and she bore a son. And the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not withheld a redeemer from you today." And a redeemer is a goel, one who redeems her widowhood and has now borne a child. "May his name be perpetuated in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain your old age, for he is born of your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons. Naomi took the child and held it to her bosom. She became its foster mother. And the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, a son is born to Naomi, and they named him Oved. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay? So Ruth is the great-grandmother of David. Give birth to Oved, who gives birth to Jesse, who gives birth to David, so to speak. This is the line of Peretz. Who is Peretz? Tamar's son through Judah. So once again, what are the chances that we get King David? We have to have the episode detailed in chapter 19 of Genesis, that dangerous situation where the daughters engage in incest to perpetuate humankind. Look at all the ways in which that episode may have been aborted on the way. Then we have the story of Judah and Tamar. What are the chances we get Peretz? Tamar needs to be loyal. Judah needs to be needy. Tamar has to be clever enough to get his cord and his seal. Otherwise, she's burned. If she's burned, no Peretz. If there's no Peretz, there's no David. Back to Genesis 19. If they're not the daughters of Lot, if they don't do what they did, there's no Moab. No Moab, no Ruth. No Ruth, no David. Judah and Tamar. No Tamar, no Peretz. No Peretz, no David. So some of these backstories show us something about the author's view, I might say, of the possibility of getting the ancestor of the Messiah. What were the chances? Minuscule. Then if we look at the book of Ruth itself, which we're about to do, we add more improbability. There has to be a famine in Moab for Naomi and Elimelech to take the family over there. There has to be not just this wonderful, wonderful wife of one of Naomi's sons, Orpah, who really wants to stay with Naomi when she's going back to Jerusalem. But Naomi convinces her to go back home. What if Ruth had been Orpah? And when Naomi says to Orpah and Ruth, go back home, what's in it for you to come back to Bethlehem, the territory of the Moabite enemies? And Ruth said, you're right, I'll go back home. No David. So this whole story as well features improbabilities. So when we think about the backstory of the arrival of David, we can see that the chances are 1 over a Google. You know what a Google is? A Google is 1 with 100 zeros after it. It's almost impossible to imagine that King David would have happened. And what are we to infer from this? Here's what I want to infer from it. That the arrival of King David is a miracle. Only something like a miracle could have made all those moments when David, when the backstory of David could have run aground and didn't. Think of the tree that leads to David and all the alternatives at every juncture. So that the author, I think, is trying to tell us, at least this is my inference, that there is something absolutely remarkable about the arrival of David. This is a celebration of the arrival of David, the importance of David to the subsequent history of biblical literature and beyond that. So, let me just make one more comment now. Okay, so what we have done so far is we've seen 2 things. One, that the book of Ruth traces the development from 2 kinds of polity, judgeship and monarchy. because it begins in the days when the judges judged, and it ends with David. That's the first story here. The second story is the improbability of the arrival of David as king. So this story is a celebration of some, let's call it, macro process in history. Okay? Judges to kings, Sodom and Gomorrah to David, we might say. But right in the substance of the story is a story of a friendship between Ruth and Naomi, which we're now going to explore. And so I want to draw an inference from that. We now have two narratives. The broad narrative of the process which leads us to the great king. Something written on the stage of history. And in that narrative is a very small narrative of the relationship between two people, as if the biblical editor, now this is a wild inference on my part, is trying to tell us that, yes, the story of humankind is described on the front pages of the newspapers, the big stories. But while the big stories are taking place, small stories, but nevertheless extremely consequential, are taking place. The obscure stories of human beings interacting may not seem to be front-page stories, but they are really the warp and the woof, the essence of the human situation. Two people working together to accomplish something. A friendship between two people who love one another and are working for a higher goal. Okay, so that to me is kind of the introduction to the book of Ruth, macro and micro. Now we're going to look at the micro situation. Patty?
You know how much I hate poking holes in your themes.
Yeah, I've noticed that over the years.
I really appreciate the literary skills of embedding these stories throughout all the Bibles, even beyond into the book of Ruth. So you get this narrative that's so lengthy and complicated. But it occurs to me that if you take any one of us in this room, it's a miracle any of us are here.
That's true.
I'm a descendant of the Donner Party. I don't think I've ever shared that with you. But one of my ancestors made it to California, obviously survived. I don't want to talk about how. But as a convert, I don't have the Holocaust in my family history that many people in this room do. It is a miracle any of us have arrived to this point. We're not King David, but his story is not unique to me in that sense.
You know, that's a great point. I want to try out a distinction and see if you buy it or if anybody buys it. And what do I care if you don't? It's true that the possibility of any of us sitting at these tables this morning is remote. It's true. I mean, all the ways in which our great-grandparents could have dated and fallen in love with somebody else, and if that had been the case, we don't exist. So I think you're right. I think the author, you won't disagree with this, I don't think. I think the author, though, is celebrating the history of his people and asking himself, what's What's the status? That's what I want to say. What's the status of my people? What's the status of our story to which we are devoted and want to continue? And the status is, well, let's just take a look at certain key figures. Let's take a look at King David, who was certainly central to our story, for better and for worse. I mean, David's a complex guy. And let's use his story. This is not just Ploni Almoni, the Hebrew for John Doe. This is not just any of us, and our stories are miracles, true. But the story of the eminence of King David can be a symbol for the power and consequentiality of our story. And if I can show that the possibility of getting King David, and therefore the monarchy, and therefore the book of Psalms, and therefore the possibility of the continuation of the monarchy, and the great leader, some kind of messianic figure. If I want to ask how all those amazing parts of our tradition happened, let's focus on the impossibility, the near impossibility of King David. So I think the author is not just interested in the miracle of anything, of any of us, but the miracle of our people, his people. And this is a symbolic, poetic way of doing it, to make King David nearly impossible. You accept that somehow, I mean, in some way, that distinction?
I accept it as a symbol that does make sense, and that's why the different stories are embedded throughout the history. But when I stop to think about it, I feel like all of us are elevated by that.
It's an important point. I mean, I don't think any of us, I don't think the biblical author would disagree with that. But the author or the editor is up to something in addition, I guess. How to poeticize the story of one's people through narrative. Scott.
Yeah, I don't think that Patty's argument necessarily weakens your point. What it does is it doesn't weaken it. It's a valid extension of it into your last statement when you said it elevates all of us. As you said last night in last night's Devar Torah, the five heroines in that otherwise pretty scary story here. They're killing babies.
Yeah.
But there's five women who stand out and prevent that from occurring. And in a sense, the Exodus is made possible because of them, and they play a key role. Each of us has that possibility, and the micro stories rather than the macro stories may be the point of it.
Good.
That at the very least, they can avoid pessimism at what are some other dark stories. If you examine the key people and the heroines and the heroes in those stories, that may elevate the story, it may elevate our background, and finally elevate us beyond what appears to be a dark background and a dark fate.
What if some editor or author tried to do the same thing with George Washington? To go back into his past and to show how improbable certain key moments were. In other words, Judah could have married anybody. So at this moment, it can go in a variety of directions. If it went in any of them but one of them, there would be no King David. And you could ask that story about anybody. So let's try it with George Washington. Why would we want to do that? Since your point is very important. Everybody's story is a miracle. But if the author wants to say something else or more, let's focus on George Washington, because George Washington is a kind of symbol of what America at its best is. And therefore, to trace his improbability also suggests, I'd use the word miracle. Maybe instead of miracle, I want to use the word wonder. There's awe, AWE, in a people's story, especially the story of persistence. And I want to tell that story, but I don't want to do it blandly. I don't want to say, we're a persistent people. We do that. No. Let me tell you the story of a key moment in the history as a symbol for all of these things. And you might say, well, not only George Washington, but all of us. But the author wants to do something else. Not in place of, I think is what we want to say. Amy?
Well, I think to generalize overarching all of this, it's a cautionary tale to everybody that you may make what you think is a random act, but you never know where that pebble is going to go.
Yeah.
And you think, literally, seminally, you think before you do something. And so it happens to be David, but it could happen to be anybody. You could give birth to Rasputin. I mean, you just don't know. And I look at all of this as sort of the teachable moment, that it's all here to teach us something. And I think that might sort of mean that who and whether it's specific is less important than what it's trying to say about the way we conduct our lives.
Yeah. Actually, just let me say one thing about this. I like your notion of agency, but I'm not sure this is a story about agency finally, but about the improbability of it, and therefore choices matter, but the sum of the choices are not a product of agency, but of something else. Some wonder, You think it's a series of agencies, yeah. And I'm trying to say that somehow this story is not just a series of agencies, but something awesome, something mysterious. It's the mystery of a people. Anyhow, Ron.
I'm struggling, pardon me, with the notion of legitimacy. This laying out the line of Perez to end with David.
Yes.
Ostensibly to give David's existence a legitimization.
Okay.
Why do we need the illegitimate beginning of that line? The incestuous relationship.
Yeah.
In order to give the legitimacy to David. Why couldn't David have been legitimately?
Yeah. Let me refer to the story quickly of Jacob and Esau. What if Jacob had not done something really problematic to create a ruse to get the birthright from Esau? There would have been no Jewish people. Esau would have blown it. The first chance he's hungry, he goes down to eat at Joe's, and he gives away his birthright. So, I think the point here, it's a problematic one, but let me state it as clearly as I can. A tough point, if I'm right about it. Morality sometimes doesn't matter. That there are imponderables in how things turn out. We'd like to think that our ancestors were all superbly moral individuals, but in fact they probably weren't, because we're human. But that's the way things work. So the question of why does this story contain just these moral problems? Well, I think is part of the point of the story, that morality is not the only engine of history. Accident, desire. After all, if Judah isn't sexually needy, he walks right past Tamar. So one could say that God is using our most basic impulses to move history ahead. And those the id, Freud's id, is not a moral entity. The id is just filled with passions, and it wants them to be satisfied. And if there weren't the superego, they probably would try to do it. Yeah. It also, I guess, I don't know. Let me stop there. I don't know if I'm right about that, but Stuart?
The Bible seems to have a dichotomy in it between the story of Ruth being the grandmother of David, great-grandmother, and Deuteronomy 23.
Yes?
Which states, no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation,
Yeah.
shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. So this points to a dichotomy between the story of Ruth and the story of Moses.
Yeah. Yeah. So what Stuart is suggesting here is we have two very different views of the Moabites. You know, in the Ruth story, they're absolutely necessary and not subject to criticism or rebuke. At best, or maybe at worst, the story is neutral about the Moabites, maybe even to be celebrated because they gave us Ruth. Whereas Deuteronomy thinks of the Moabites as the enemies. And as a matter of fact, in the history of ancient Israel, the Moabites are sometimes enemies and sometimes friends. When David is on the run, trying to flee and evade Saul, he sends his parents over to Moab for safety. So, you know, maybe that twofold view of the Moabites is reflected in history. At certain points, enemies, at certain points, friends. I suppose a simpler way of saying it is, biblical literature comes from many different sources. We've seen contradictions all over the place. In Genesis 1, the animals come before human beings. In Genesis 2, human beings come before the animals. Who is it who said, is it Goethe? Do I contradict myself? Yes, I contradict myself. So I don't know if that's satisfactory, but you put your finger on an issue, and maybe it points to the logic of the higher criticism of the Bible, the study of sources, that there are many different sources, and an editor sometimes didn't smooth them all out. Bennett?
It seems to me that David comes from a line of ancestors that are willing to take chances and to get what they want. And he kind of inherits that in the way he lives, that he's willing to do almost anything for what he wants. It shows how that line influenced the life of David.
So Bennett's point is really an interesting point, that to trace David's ancestry is not just to trace the biology, so to speak, who married whom, but also to trace certain human characteristics. And David's ancestors do what's necessary to gain the goal they're looking for. Very clever and so on, instrumental in their morality, we might say. And that's David. And so David is really not only the sum or the result of his biological ancestors, but also of their family characteristics. I like the point. The interesting point. Yeah. Malcolm?
It strikes me that this book that we're studying is...
Which book?
The Bible.
The Bible.
person's history. It's not a novel. It's not a fiction. It's not a story.
Okay.
I mean, there are stories, but the authors have a purpose in mind. So we today can ask these questions legitimately, but the story, the trajectory and the characters, information is in the book, and there's lots of information that's not in the book.
Okay.
But there's a purpose to all of that, which has to do with the relationship of man to God and how these, I'll call them heroes or leaders, have influenced the people and influenced God's relationship to man.
So you're making the point that let's look at the big sweep, the big arc of biblical literature, and what is it ultimately about? And it's about something cosmic, something theological, and that is the relationship between God and human beings. And all the little episode stories, genealogies, and so on, are all serving that purpose.
They're fascinating, but yes, that's the ultimate purpose.
Right. So that is, if you're right, what you've gotten to is the form of biblical literature. That is, the overall structure is, as you've suggested. The next question is, and how do the elements, the substance of the book contribute? What is the substance of that story? We know the arc is something macro, something large, a big relationship. But what's the nature of that relationship?
Well, that's what we've been studying for thousands of years and arguing about.
Right. And that's the question of biblical theology. And there was in the 50s and 60s, I think, a biblical theology movement where authors are talking about what is the basic story in its substance. And the biblical theology movement, as I understand it, ran aground because no one big answer was what's the word here? Immune from really important criticisms. So maybe the answer is it's many. Stuart's point about the Moabites. I mean, how are we going to? What's the synthesis of those two views of the Moabites? Maybe there is none. Maybe there are just two views of the Moabites in the Bible, and you can't harmonize them. Maybe there are two views of morality. Honor your father and your mother. Unfortunately, when Jacob comes in to the dying blind father, he creates a ruse. He says, I'm Esau. Honor your father and mother. Jacob doesn't do this. But Jacob is one of the Bible's heroes, precisely, as Bennett suggests, for his kind of Machiavellian, I want a certain outcome, and the means justify the ends. That's not Ten Commandments morality. And maybe we can't reduce the two of those things to something unified. Jim?
In reference to what Eddie was saying, if God is timeless, which I think, well, I feel that way, I guess most of us do, the circumstance in the time that it happened let these people be the heroes. In other words, there may be some genius being born right this minute, but if the circumstance never presents itself, neither he or anybody else will know.
Right.
So what I'm getting at is God's hand in all of this. I mean, we all come and go.
Yeah.
We're little links in this big chain that we call humanity.
Yeah.
But if we don't arrive at a certain circumstance, none of the things that occur later will happen. You never know if you do a favor for somebody, 30 years later, his nephew shows up and reciprocates. Why? Well, you did this for my uncle years ago. I've had that experience, and it's all timing, and our time is limited. And so I think it underscores once again the overwhelming timelessness and power of the God we're all looking at.
I'm surprised by your conclusion. I thought your conclusion should be the ultimacy of randomness.
Yeah.
Well, it's not. What I'm saying is, depending where you're looking from, it's not random.
It could be random if I were not theologically inclined. Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting point. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his philosophical investigations, has a page where he has an illustration of a rabbit, and he says, if you turn it this way, it's a duck. So what is it? Well, it depends on how you look at it. It's perspectival. That's Nietzsche's great point. It's all a matter of the perspective. And that's your point, too. I mean, the data doesn't lead to just one conclusion. The data that you point out, why this guy comes back 30 years later, could be just random, you know. On the other hand, it could be some elements of a larger story, a larger history, a larger opportunity, and maybe the way we look at these details determines how we live our lives. Maida?
Go along with Malcolm. This is a story, and it's a story, in my perspective, written by men to make the story rounded out and et cetera. Because two daughters sleep with their father once. Tamar sleeps with her father-in-law once, and they get pregnant. Excuse me. It just doesn't, it isn't that way.
Okay, and what point are you making?
You know how powerful
What point are you making, Maida?
My point is that this was written by men.
Yeah.
And that this is to
I see what you're saying.
This is to create a story that will work to enhance and to glorify the certain men in this story. Now, yes, there are women who have to play their parts, and they play their parts. Except for somebody like Ruth and Naomi and maybe Miriam. They're really about men, and women do not conceive necessarily one time.
Yeah.
I want to just disclaim that I was the sexist.
You were what? You were what?
I want to disclaim that I am the author of some sexism.
Okay, by the way, though, yeah, the Bible is patriarchal. I don't think there's any doubt about it. We've tried to make, at least I've tried to make the case over the years, and I just did it last night again in my Devar Torah, that there is a strong, what I call, counter-narrative there. And the story of the 5 women at the beginning of the book of Exodus is a parade example. They defeat Pharaoh in advance. When the daughter of Pharaoh comes down and expresses pity on the Israelite child from the very palace of the tyranny, that is in a way a symbolic defeat. It's a premonition, it's a foreshadowing. So yes, there's patriarchy, but there's also a counter-narrative. But I want to say something else. I mean, so, composers choose their framework. So Mozart uses a tonal framework, right? There's a home key, there's a dominant key, there's a subdominant. They're related to one another. This is a system. Arnold Schoenberg rejected the system in what he called the emancipation of the dissonance, because in the tonal system there are some notes and chords that don't belong in the scale, and therefore they're heard as dissonant. And that's one of the things that makes music go. The move to dissonance, and it's a yearning for home and to come back home at the end. Schoenberg didn't like that and emancipated the dissonance in the sense that every note has equal value now for Schoenberg. So there's no such thing as dissonance. The question, though, is not what are the elements of the music, but what they do with it. It's true that this author has a certain kind of, let's call it, point of view about pregnancy. Yeah, right. But the question is, what emerges from that? One analyzes Schoenberg not by saying, you have this bad system, but the kind of music generated from it. And I think the same thing can be said about the biblical author. It's not so much what elements of the system you're working with. Let's suppose the male author doesn't get the infrequency of an actual pregnancy out of sexual intercourse. He doesn't get that. That's his system, for better or for worse. What does he do with it? What he does with it is something quite magnificent.
I understand. I'm just saying that because of these various men who wrote this,
Yes?
that the perception of how this all came to be was like that.
Yeah, no, I get that. But everybody has a starting point, and one can say the starting point is a prejudice, or it's narrow or limited, and that would be fair. But ultimately, what are you doing with it? I mean, Homer inherits a variety of stories. What does he do with it? Yeah, that's what matters.
But he's created his story, as are these men.
Absolutely. And as Malcolm wants to point out, this is a story with huge consequences for history. Vivian.
I would like to go back to, first of all, your myth, legend, and covenant, where you started.
Okay.
And I love where you went with composition. And so to piggyback on Mal's analogy of historical, and back to the word that we're shunning, but miracle.
Okay.
I'm just going to suggest
Yes.
reading the Bible as the book is more novel than history.
Okay.
And if you think about its arrival here on the desk in discussion, it is a miracle.
What's the miracle?
Book is a miracle
The book
of
is
human composition.
Composition.
That's just, think about all the iterations, all the discussions, all the arguments, all the complexities and all the lines in between this composition. And there you have all our discussion for on and onward, to me. So, I read it as a novel, but I like to think of it more as a composition. And to me, a musical composition and playing it with people, listening to it, and how it lives is a miracle.
Interesting. So you're talking about, the text itself. And the reason it's a miracle is look at how long and deeply we've been looking at it.
And you never quibble over every note, who was conceived when, what, huh? Those are the breadcrumbs that we're picking up all along the way.
A food metaphor.
Well, I can put anything in it.
But a food
on the table, it is.
A food metaphor is great, nourishment.
That's all I
No. I think it's a very good point. You know, sometimes people ask, what's the authority of the Bible? And my answer is always, let's talk about the three tenses, past, present, and future. We can talk about the authority of a book in terms of the authority of the author. So that if God wrote the Bible, that makes the book authoritative, ipso facto. If we want to ask, that's one way of looking at authority. Another way is what came from it. And what came from it are three great durable traditions. I mean, the youngest is Islam. It's already 1,500 years old. That is a long, long time. So if three great traditions have come from it that are still alive and giving life, that itself is kind of a proof of the authority of the book. So past, future, you're arguing for present. What's the book itself? And the book, any book that can generate millennia of discussion. Think of one we've had this morning. And many of us have been doing this for a long, long time, and we still find it very exciting and in a way obscure. We're trying to make sense of it, and it doesn't yield to our desire real easily. Stuart's example is a good one. We'd love to get the Moabite thing straight. Let's keep working on it. Well, the Bible resists getting it straight. And maybe it's that very resistance that is part of. So you're making a claim that the Bible is, I can't go beyond one of the greatest of all books. I mean, could we make a uniqueness claim that the Bible and the Bible alone exists on the plane of excellence, durability, and so on? I don't know if we could make that claim. But it's certainly one of them, and how do we know it? Just what you've said is how when will we finish these discussions? When will we finally say, yeah, we got it? Never. And that's a tribute to the book. I mean, if it were a mess, there are two ways of a book not being domesticable. One is, it's a mess, and let's give it up. The other is, it may look like a mess, but there's a lot of power and coherence in it. And I think that's what we feel about the biblical literature. Gosh, that's a nice, I really appreciate your comment. The energy it generates.
Maybe
Amy?
the point about the dichotomy about the Moabites is the point that this book may have the ultimate answers, but we're never going to know what they are, because it's sort of like what's going through my head is not so fast. Whatever you think at the surface, if you look at it in a different way, it's going to be something that, what is it, they talk about a blind man and an elephant, or, you know. And maybe that's the point, is we should never be so sure of ourselves and our point of view that we think it begins and ends with us, that there's something greater, and we have to consider all the nuances.
Yeah, it strikes me that your description is focusing on the Bible as literature, a complex literature. Maybe one reason why we all agree with you, to some degree or another, is that we're not a halachic form of Judaism. We're not interested in what does the Bible tell us about how to act. Of course we care about how to act, and the Bible does tell us a lot about that, but we don't feel that it's imperative, do we? Unless we've come to it. Honor the aged, Leviticus 19. Yeah, we go for that. We're not sure that in the details we would agree with some Orthodox rabbi. So I'm wondering whether or not an Orthodox rabbi conducting these discussions might resist our sense that the Bible is finally literature. I think the rabbi would look for law and say, I'm dividing this discussion up between halakha and agadah, between law and lore, between law and literature. And the literature, great, you can have it, I don't care, talk about it. And of course, there are a lot of opinions. The famous phrase in Midrash, davar acher, there's another view. So the author will say X, and then we get the davar acher. But this guy says something else. The whole Talmud starts with the question, from what time in the morning may we say the Shema? And it also then deals with the question, up to what time? And that first Mishnah doesn't resolve the matter. It's up to midnight, it's up to when the first stars are, I can't remember the other alternatives. Because Agadah doesn't really care to fully resolve the issue. But if I want to know what to do, am I wrong if I wait till 2 days later? So, the idea of Bible as literature, which is, I think, the motif here, it may not be universally accepted as the final. I'm tying myself up into a little bit of a knot here, but you get the point here. I mean, it may be that this group has a certain predilection, and we do very well with it, but there might be other approaches to it. We don't care that the Bible is chaotic, that there are different. We've made some points here, but we recognize there's another view of the Moabites, because we're not so interested in the answer, but the process, which is great. Jackie.
Do you have a friend, an acquaintance who is an Orthodox rabbi, who could come in one day and have a discussion and see where the two sides stand?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. What's that? What'd you say?
They'll never be the same.
Yeah, so I shouldn't pick a friend that I especially like. It's a good point. It's a good point. Don't think about that.
It's interesting to see another viewpoint and have a discussion with the other person and see what his response or her responses are.
Some of you studied with Moshe Berger over the years, used to be at the college, and maybe a good person because he's an Orthodox rabbi, but with a capacity for entertaining other views and thinking about them. Ellen.
I also think it comes into play what time in history we're surviving, we're living through. I doubt that had we been born in the 1500s, we might see the same with the Inquisition and all that going on, or 1400s. Well, it depends on the time that we're living in, and even the Orthodox now have several orthodoxies that are divided as to what's the true orthodoxy, and they have the kind of reform orthodoxy. And so I think we interpret this book as to not only what it says to us, but what we're looking for at what time.
I love that point. When I was at Hebrew Union College, there was what we called the long corner. You walked a certain distance and there were a bunch of stores there. And in our fourth year, something like that, the teacher of one of the classes said, go up to the long corner and make a list of every single store. And what we discovered was, even though we had been there many, many, many times, we never knew that more than half of them existed. We went to the stores that interested us, and we didn't know. So that's your point. I mean, if two people go up there with different interests, you're going to see different stores. And if you're not interested, so there are blinds. Not only are we seeing in certain ways, depending on who we are, or as you put it, when we have lived, what period in history, but we don't see things that are there because we're not predisposed to be interested in them. I think it's a wonderful point. Yeah. Stanley Fish, who was a literary critic, I think wrote a book with the title, "Is There a Text in This Class?" In other words, does a text really exist, or merely the interpretations of the text? What is the text, aside from the ways in which it's read? How would we know what weight to give to each part of it? The genealogies, who thinks the genealogies are of the essence of understanding biblical literature? But if you're, a geneticist, maybe it's just what, I remember, what's his name? The poet came here. He wrote the book on, the poem on the fire in New York City. What do you call that fire? Where? The dress wagon. Who's the poet who? The shirt, yeah, right. And the poet of that came here and gave a talk on the genealogies in the Noah story. It was one of the most fascinating lectures I've ever heard on totally unpromising material. And yet he made something very promising out of it. So, anyhow, yeah, Ron.
Everybody likes to finally ask the question, what's the moral of the story? If I took the story of Ruth standing alone,
Yes.
would the moral be that exigencies trump morality?
You mean given all the context we put around it this morning? Yeah. Why not say what are some of the morals of the book of Ruth? I mean, you limit it by saying what's the, and I think is that fair? What's the meaning of my life? Seriously? One thing? So would you be happy if we tried to list the 3 or 4 main points of the story? Or would that somehow be not elegant enough?
I'd start there.
You'd start with many, and you'd see if you could reduce the number. Because there's something elegant, something powerful about the moral, if we can get to it. Good. So next week, Ron is leading the discussion. And by the way, Ron, lots of luck. Yeah. So please come and support Ron. In 2 weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to search for the meaning of the book of Ruth. Okay, very good. Shabbat shalom. Mel, how about you?
Good, thanks. 2 things I wanted to share. One, I was at the Cleveland Museum of Art this week, and on temporary exhibit is the final.
Thanks, John.
Original.
Yes, thank you.
The sole but final original manuscript of the Mahler's Second Symphony, and it's some 230 pages, but of course not all of it's on this right. It's in 2 long cabinets, and there must be a total of 12 pages this way. But do you read music? Mm-hmm. So, this is in his hand. I'm in with a pen, with, what starts off as blank sheets of paper. And I don't know why it struck me this way, but I was just, after just looking through all of these pages, struck with the genius that a person sits with blank pages and a keyboard, I guess, a piano, and over a period of 5 or 6 years, a long period of time, but creates this thing.
Yeah.
And
you put your
so all those are is blank pieces of paper that have been, that some number of, not just, I'll say men and women, but people who are unknown to us as opposed to women,
Right.
have set down. What genius. So it's just, I mean, I suppose you can look at any piece of art that's hanging in the wall of the CMA and have this was a blank canvas one day. And someone with their mind and with their hand and their eye created this enduring masterpiece. So,
That's very powerfully put. I agree with you. Just to think about what it took to get from the blank to the Second Symphony, you know, or even a little sonnet. I mean, that endures.
yeah.
No, I think it's a great one.
But I don't know, it's not on permanent display. It's actually owned by the Cleveland Orchestra. It was gifted by one of the international members of the board of the Cleveland Orchestra. It's gifted to the orchestra. They've asked the Museum of Art to maintain it because they have the expertise to manage such something like that.
In his hand.
Whose piece is this?
This is Mahler's Second Symphony.
Oh, my favorite.
It's on, the original manuscript is on display for a limited time at the Cleveland Museum of Art on the second floor in the rotunda.
Oh, I'm going.
And I was just explaining to Roger, I spent some time just looking at it, and it just, you know, it's so inspiring to just imagine.
I've got goosebumps all.
You know, when the orchestra did it, they displayed a few pages in the foyer, which I saw.
Yeah.
Yeah, but is the whole thing
No,
out
no,
there?
no, no, no,
Or
no.
just
It's,
some?
but it's so, but yes,
More than
as
a
I say,
couple
there
of
must be a dozen pages.
Yeah, you actually, like you're in the workshop of the composer.
Yeah.
Here's his hand.
And the final page with his signature and double bars at the end, but you know it's finished, and it's just.
And that's in the Maestro movie. That's the Bernstein. That's what he's conducting.
Yeah.
I think it's that scene is a caricature of Bernstein.
Yes,
I did
so
not
do
like
I.
it.
I didn't either.
I didn't either. No, it was.
I've seen Bernstein conducted. I mean, on YouTube.
Yeah, it was a
And it's amazing.
That was almost a cartoonish.
That's a good way of putting it.
It is.
Yeah. No, the movie I thought failed, but
The other thing, just to, so I have.
You do too? Okay,
Yes.
yeah. And they
I'm
working
just
for you?
5 weeks ago.
Oh,
and
seriously.
there's so much I can hear today that I couldn't hear before.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you know, you don't realize, you know, I had
How much you're
cataract
missing.
surgery a couple of years ago, and again, similarly, you don't realize what you've lost in terms of color and acuity because it's gradual.
It's gradual.
So, but the only thing, so two things. One,
Wear them.
well, yeah, I mean, don't give up. I mean, don't be frustrated. But also, I've had, I don't know, 3 or 4 follow-ups since I was originally fitted. I've had the audiologist adjust these, retune them. So, for example, I thought the high frequencies to me sounded tinny.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't had the problem with not comfortable with my own voice, but the kind of what the microphone and the actual what